Pittsburgh Sucks Week. It is our 22nd annual version of that as we head up to Pittsburgh and the Confluence. Luke Jones knows this trip all too well, and I am very grateful for Mr. Rooney feeding me Christmas dinner last year and then curdling it at the end. I do hope that Sunday night goes a little better this week, but certainly for the Ravens, Luke, the expectations are higher, right? Like, no one's expecting to go up to Pittsburgh and lose 31-3 on Sunday night. As a matter of fact, this version of the Ravens that showed itself to be a relatively complete football team on Sunday against the Detroit Lions, I think all of our expectations have risen where for the last month we're like, well, we'll lose the Pittsburgh game, but let's win all the rest of them. I don't know that it matters winning the Pittsburgh game, this 5th seed, 6th seed thing, and where these other 4 teams are at this point in trying to win divisions in the South and in the West. But, it's not outside the realm of possibility. I don't expect them to win in Pittsburgh, but I won't be shocked if they do.
Yeah, I think that's a fair way to put it. I mean, it's Ravens-Steelers anyway. I mean, we know what this rivalry has looked like. Even years where the Ravens aren't very good, even years where the Steelers aren't very good, you'll get close competitive games, and we've had situations where one team that's clearly inferior to the other, if you look at the whole body of work, ends up winning. So the good news is for the Ravens, as you alluded to, unlike last year, the stakes aren't nearly as high. The Ravens aren't in a position where if they go up to Pittsburgh and lose on Sunday night that their season's over, like it was last Christmas, and they weren't playing for anything the final week of the season. They're 7-5. They have a game up on the Bills, the Chargers, the Raiders, and if you look at the conference record, which in the case of the Raiders, the Ravens have the head-to-head, but the Chargers and Bills, you look at conference record, the Ravens have a lead in that department as well. So as much as you do look at this game more favorably than you did a few weeks ago where you would have said, well, this one's going to be ugly most likely, certainly they're the underdog. I think that's pretty clear, and that's fair when you're talking about a team that you entered Week 13 3 games behind. But it's certainly within the realm of possibility if their offense plays much more like it did against the Detroit Lions to go up there and get a victory. So
I'd say it's a different team than what we saw in the aftermath of Wembley, which is the last time we saw the Steelers, and that was as lopsided a Steelers-Ravens game as you'll see.
Yeah. I mean, that was pretty lopsided. I mean, especially the thing for the Ravens at that point in time. Keep in mind that was pretty early into Brandon Williams' absence. That's when we really saw the run defense take a turn for the worse. The run defense has been superb for going on 5 games now. I think it's very clear that whatever issues they had in addition to Brandon Williams not being out there have been cleaned up. Now, certainly you got to continue that over the final quarter of the season, but I think you feel better about that. And I said this to you in one of our earlier conversations in breaking down Sunday's win. If the Ravens can even just go to Pittsburgh, even if they don't win the game, but if their offense can, for a second straight week, look competent, look productive, go on the road and score over 20 points against a really good defense statistically, I think you feel a lot better about the Ravens moving forward, not just getting into the playoffs, because at this point, quite frankly, there's no excuse for this team not to be in the playoffs, especially after winning against Detroit on Sunday.
Well, that's strange to say after you and I sat here and just kicked them around in September and October, right? I mean, it really is. It's a little bizarre to be in the driver's seat for the playoffs because I don't think anybody really expected this back in October when things were falling apart and the knee and people weren't going to the games. People still aren't going to the games, but, the excuse was, well, the team's no good. Well, they're not no good anymore. I mean, they're not great, but they're not bad. And I do think they're going to have double-digit wins. You're going to look back on the back of the football card and it says 10 wins, 11 wins, whatever it's going to say, and you're going to think that's a representative season for John Harbaugh and Joe Flacco this year.
It is, and I think it's important to acknowledge circumstances have been very favorable. As crazy as that sounds, too, right? Because we were talking about injuries before the season even started, and you're saying, okay, realistically, how good can this team be? I mean, we knew the offense wasn't going to be all that great, even when they had all their players healthy, and then we saw the injuries that they had in training camp and the first couple weeks of the season, but because of the schedule, because of the mediocrity in the rest of this AFC wild card race, I mean, the Ravens statistically, even before the Lions win on Sunday, were up, up in the 70% range, depending on which site and which metrics you want to use, kind of had that as being their playoff chance. So they're in really good shape in that regard. This isn't a great team, at least certainly not right now, but it does look a lot better than it did, say, a month ago, because they have cleaned some things up. I mean, that run defense that was horrid for about a 4 or 5 week stretch has been superb. Now, their defense took a major hit with the Jimmy Smith injury, and as I wrote at WNST.net, we knew this offense needed to be better down the stretch anyway. That just kind of brings the reality into sharper focus that they need to get more offense. Now, do they need to score 44 points every week? Do I think the defense is going to drop off that much? No, because they do have more depth. They are better equipped to endure that injury, and you hope that that's not a case where it's going to torpedo their season. And frankly, the schedule sets up far more favorably than the final month last year after they lost Jimmy Smith. But can this offense find a higher level of consistent productivity? I don't expect it to be great, but can they be better than they've been or than they were over the first 11 games of the season? If they can do that, then we're not just talking about a team playing in January. I think we're talking about a team that has a chance to be interesting in January, but they've got to build on this. It can't just be a pleasant aberration, kind of like how the Oakland game played out earlier this year, where they go out to the West Coast, they beat the Raiders. They had gotten back up to, I guess they were 3-2 at that point, and then they come home and they laid an egg against the Chicago Bears. I mean, you can't have something like that happen. If you go to Pittsburgh on Sunday night and not just lose, but you only score 13 points, then you're right back to saying, I don't know. I'm not sure this defense can just carry the load, especially without Jimmy Smith now. So, if there's any, I don't even want to call it a silver lining, because there is no silver lining when you lose someone like Jimmy Smith, but any notions of this team continuing to win with the formula it used for the better part of 11 weeks, I think that went out the window with Jimmy Smith crumpling to the ground with about 4 minutes to go in the second quarter.
Well, and the question is, who's going to run around with Antonio Brown? Who's going to run around when Tom Brady's chasing him around if they get that far, and that is their draw in the second week after beating Blake Bortles or beating Phillip Rivers? And obviously matchups would be troublesome against good quarterbacks and good wide receivers, and I guess that's this part of the schedule where we're beating Tom Savage and Brett Hundley. But, certainly on Sunday, getting back to the Lions game, Matt Stafford and the wide receiving core, this was a legitimate group. So, I give them high marks for winning on Sunday. I mean, I looked at it as, well, they can still make the playoffs and be painfully mediocre or ordinary, even if they lose to Detroit and Pittsburgh. I am impressed. I'm more impressed by the Lions' victory than perhaps any of the rest this year. And I'm more impressed by the fact that they are playing their best football in December. So there is something to be said about that, and there is something about me getting out the old purple rope lights that we used to hang around here in the early days of Festivus, back when it was all new and purple and lovely 15 years ago. I know the populace is not of that mindset, but I still think the pedigree of a Suggs, of a Flacco, of a Harbaugh for this team, veteran guys like Weddle trying to get there, I think they will be well prepared if they make it through this stretch of the schedule. There's no reason that they should have an excuse to losing to Jacoby Brissett or to Marvin at the end of the year, that if they are playing football in January, they're going to be a dangerous team and a tough out. I believe that. I don't think they're going to go up to Foxborough and lose 41-6 in a playoff game. I just don't see that happening.
Well, that's a big if their offense builds on this. If their offense reverts to where it's been, frankly, prior to this Sunday's game, then I could easily see that happening, because their defense isn't going to be quite as good without Jimmy Smith. So, but your pedigree point, I think, is fair. As much as I think some people have leaned on that narrative too much, when you consider there aren't many guys left from 2011 and 2012. And there's even been a lot of turnover from 2014. If you look at that roster that was up in New England and had a 2-touchdown lead at 2 different points in the divisional round. But there is enough of those players left where you'd like to think the pedigree's there for this team to potentially make a run at least into the second round and be competitive. But again, that's a big if. I don't want to leave this. This offense shouldn't be off the hook just because it played one great game. I mean, that's not the way it works. We know it's a week-to-week thing in the NFL, and the body of work for 11 games said this was one of the worst offenses in the NFL. So you like seeing that they played so well, and I think they certainly deserve credit for the way they played. But I'm not ready just to sign off and say, okay, bring on the Patriots, bring on the Steelers. This team's got to show that they can score points a little more consistently. And like I said, I don't expect this defense to collapse, but I think it's a much taller order asking this defense to just carry the rest of the team when they've lost arguably their best player. So we'll see. I think as much as we look at these games, and we were kind of looking at this Detroit-Pittsburgh stretch as being really important and not knowing how crucial it would be, say, a month ago, I think now you recognize and say, okay, they can lose to Pittsburgh and still be in excellent position to make the playoffs, assuming they win the games they're supposed to over the final 3 weeks. But I think this is an opportunity, as Detroit was on Sunday, for an eyeball test standpoint to actually look the part. Look like you can go up to Pittsburgh, look like you can go to New England and be competitive and score some points and make it a really close game in the fourth quarter. And then at that point, maybe your defense does make a play. Maybe your special teams gives you the kind of play that you need to give you the edge. But again, I need to see this offense back it up. It's great to score, 37 points, and then you get the defensive score to have 44 points. But it doesn't mean much if you go up to Pittsburgh and you score 13 points, and then you go to Cleveland and you score 16 points, and then you're grinding out a win against Jacoby Brissett. And I still think, even without their offense playing at a high level, they probably can still win 3 out of 4. The schedule sets up that way, but if that's the way it plays out and you're just grinding out games and your offense is back to not doing a whole lot, I'm not going to be as optimistic that they can make any real noise in January.
He is Luke Jones. He is Baltimore Luke out on Twitter and Luke at WNST.net. This portion of our WNST programming brought to you by our friends at GNA in Highlandtown. The best hot dogs in the world, the French fry, the gravy, the breakfast, and Andy there serving up those dogs on his forearm there if you ask him to, with the chili and the cheese and the sauerkraut and anything else. It's good. GNA Coney Island hot dog. I've been eating those since the 1970s up in Highlandtown. Also brought to you by our friends at Deli-ish on Wise Avenue in Dundalk, New York-style deli with Reuben's, corned beef, and legit sandwiches like the Curly Fryer. They cater in, delibaltimore.com for the holidays if you're having a special event, or if you're just over in Dundalk, stop by and get one of those lean corned beef sandwiches on a little toasted rye. They're Deli-ish on Wise Avenue in Dundalk. Luke, around the league, we talk about the Ravens. I don't want to call them surging, but they've won 3 in a row, and they beat a good team at home by 24 points on Sunday, so I'll call it surging for now. But the scoreboard watching part of this for me is in 4 different places, which I know Pittsburgh and New England will get there, and they'll be sitting around watching everybody on television the first week of the playoffs anyway. But where shall the Ravens go? Where will they be? Will they be a 5 seed? Will they be a 6 seed? Obviously, beating Pittsburgh this week would put them in a catbird position to potentially be a 5 seed and play a 4 seed. I don't know that there's a lot of difference at this point between Jacksonville, Nashville, Kansas City, San Diego. I'll say this, Kansas City's fading so quickly it's hard to imagine they're even going to be there, but I don't think much of San Diego either, or L.A. or Carson or whatever the hell they're calling themselves these days. But, these are the other 4 teams that we're watching to say, all right, if we get there, where will we go? Who will we face? I don't know that there's any preference on this. As a matter of fact, I'm just trying to figure out maybe some likelihood as to where it would be. I mean, all along we believe, well, if they get in, if they squeak in, if there's some way for them to get in. This is 3 weeks ago when they're a sub-500 team. We thought, well, they'll be the 6 seed and they'll play the 3 seed, and that'll certainly be Kansas City. Well, all that's changed in the last 3 weeks.
Well, I think that part of it. I mean, chances are they're still going to be the 6 seed. Keep in mind, you're talking most likely Tennessee or whoever doesn't win that AFC South. That's going to be the other wild card. And keep in mind, both Tennessee and Jacksonville have a head-to-head tiebreaker over the Ravens. So it's not as though the Ravens can finish tied with one of those teams. They have to finish ahead of one of those teams.
Well, they'll play each other, right? I mean, that's where we are at this point. At the quarter pole left, it looks like they'll be the two teams that are sitting at 4 and 5, right?
Yeah,
or 3 and 5. So they wouldn't play each other, right?
Well, but my point is, if we're trying to determine if the Ravens are the 5 or the 6 seed, right now they're 2 games behind the number 5.
Fair enough.
Jacksonville, because they don't have that head-to-head. So that's my point. I mean, chances are they're not going to be the number 5 seed. I mean, it's not impossible, but it's not probable at this point. So you do look at that. If the playoffs were to start right now, you would be talking about going to Nashville and playing the Tennessee Titans, which seems like a very reasonable proposition. Certainly they lost when they went there not terribly long ago, but the Ravens were in position. And again, it goes back to what I said before. They've got to build on what they did on Sunday. And when I say, keep in mind, when I say they need to build on that, that doesn't mean I think the offense needs to score 37 points every week, and they're not going to do that. I mean, no one really does that unless you're the 2007 Patriots or last year's Falcons or something crazy like that. But can you just be more consistently productive? At least be consistently mediocre, which they've struggled to even do anything resembling that so far this year. But I think it is fascinating to look at the rest of this race. I mean, of the teams that are chasing the Ravens right now, to me, the Chargers are the only team that's of interest. I think the Bills are not very good whatsoever, and who knows what's going to happen now with Tyrod Taylor's knee injury. I know initial reaction was maybe it wasn't so serious, but certainly that's, when you're being called into the locker room, that's not an encouraging sign, and especially seeing what Nathan Peterman did against the Chargers a couple weeks ago. But I'm not a believer in Buffalo. I'm not a believer in Oakland at this point, and I had high hopes for the Raiders, but I just don't think they're very good, period, as they didn't have the easiest go of it against the Giants on Sunday. The Chargers are the team to watch out for, and that's more relevant for Kansas City at this point, considering the way the Chiefs have played and the way they melted down in the final minutes on Sunday. But if you're the Ravens, looking at the Chargers, looking at their remaining schedule, if there's one thing you're concerned about is the possibility of them running the table, then it becomes a little more interesting. But at the same time, you still look at the conference record and see that going into Week 14 now, the Ravens have 2 games on them in the loss column for conference record, which is big, which essentially makes that a 2-game advantage once again. So,
good God, by the way, the Chiefs are 1-6. I just looked down.
Yeah.
They've won 1 game since October 8th. I mean, it's really, and it's not going well. They have 3 games in a row at home now. I didn't realize that. They have Oakland, the Chargers, and Miami at home, then have to go to Denver to end the season. They got a much tougher road than, let's say, the Chargers do at this point, who are playing like the Redskins, and I think I'm going to look at the rest of their schedule. Chargers have Redskins, Chiefs, Jets, Raiders, 2 home and 2 away. That game is played in Kansas City, so it will be a little chilly on the 16th. We're getting ready for the Cleveland game, and they're playing each other. But the scoreboard watching part of this is kind of fun as well, I think.
Yeah, I mean, it's fun when you have the advantage. It's not fun when you're asking 3 different teams to lose or 3 different games to go a certain way. That's when it's not fun. That's when it's more of a desperate feeling. And the Ravens have been in that position in the past, but they're in position, even going to Pittsburgh and knowing how difficult that one's going to be next Sunday night, they're still in a position where things still look favorable. Things are still looking up, even if they lose that game, but that's assuming you take care of your business in Cleveland. And who knows now with Josh Gordon back in the picture, who, by the way, looked pretty good in his first game in, 3 years. Kind of incredible to think about how that story's played out. But it's still the Browns. I mean, enough said. And then you come home and you play 2 other teams that have been sub-500 temes for the bulk of the season, especially Indianapolis. And Bengals, we'll see. I mean, it's a division game. You certainly don't want to be in a position where you're fighting for your life, not knowing what Marvin Lewis's team might do Week 17. But it's sitting right there. And again, like I said, even the Chargers, who from an eyeball test standpoint, appear to be the biggest threat. And, some people have gone as far to say they look like the third best team in the AFC right now, just how they're looking. Not by record, obviously, but I still think even with them, the Ravens still are going to have to stub their toe here pretty significantly and not just lose to Pittsburgh, but possibly lose one of these final 3 games, and then you're starting to look at tiebreaker scenarios, which, like I said, the Ravens conference record, if there's one thing you can say about the Ravens having 5 losses, 2 of them have come against the NFC, and that's something that is, frankly, that's something that's important because they're not in a position where their conference records sitting there at 5-5 or something of that nature, because that's the most important tiebreaker if you don't have that head-to-head with other teams. So scoreboard watching's fun when you're the one that's being chased by some of these other teams. But it's definitely going to be fascinating to see what happens in this AFC West, where we've talked about the Chiefs and the Chargers, but keep in mind, even if I'm not buying what they're selling at this point, the Raiders are also 6-6. So it's incredible. I vividly remember talking to you probably. It was right around the London game or right around... I
was going to say week 4. The AFC West was the best division in football, for sure.
It looked that way. And keep in mind, even then, the Broncos had gotten off to a good start. So...
and they have the defense. We just figured they'll figure out the quarterback, right?
Yeah. I mean, the Broncos actually looked like a representative, good football team in the month of September. And boy, I mean, they're just horrible.
They look like one of the 5 worst teams in the league right now.
Yeah, I mean, they're a team that you're talking about for a top 5 pick at this point. So it really speaks to how things change. There's no question about that. And, it's funny, on that same topic, I mean, look at the NFC South, which a couple years ago was being mocked for not even having a team with a winning record winning that division. And now, I mean, you look at that division, and the Saints and the Panthers have been superb, and Atlanta, despite the fact that they haven't been able to recapture their magic from a year ago, they're still in the thick of it. That division's been really, really good. So it just shows how quickly things can change. But if you're the Ravens, you look at this crazy playoff picture, you look at the scoreboard watching. Again, say what you want about the Ravens themselves, and they have their weaknesses, and we've talked about that at length, and we'll continue to talk about that at length. But when you look at the entire picture of the AFC, the entire picture of the NFL, Ravens are sitting in pretty good shape to at least get a ticket to the dance. Time will tell if they're going to be ready to actually do something when they get there.
He is Luke Jones. He is our insider for all things Owings Mills as we celebrate Pittsburgh week here as we make our trip up to the Confluence to take on the Steelers this week. Quarter pole left here in the season. It's all brought to you by our friends at Freedmont Mortgage. Don't make a 30-year mistake by choosing the wrong lender. You need Carl Delmont and our friends at Freedmont Mortgage. Go to Freedmont.com, out online, learn how to buy, sell. Maybe you want to refinance. You just want some education, get some questions answered. They're always there for you at Freedmont Mortgage and Freedmont.com. Also, brought to you by D&L Window Tinting. 26 years of tinting everything over at D&L. They do cars, boats, businesses. They put the shades on the sun and take away the squint. They are in Parkville and in White Marsh. Very appreciative for the longtime sponsorship of Jason and our friends over at D&L Window Tinting. Luke, you mentioned the tiebreaker and the fact that the Ravens are maybe not totally set into the 6th position. And I looked at the rest of the schedule for Tennessee and for Jacksonville, and hey, I will concede that the winner of that division should be the 3 seed, and the 6 seed would play there. And where we are with San Diego and Kansas City at 6-6, almost certainly the 4 seed, you talk about the Chargers being the scariest team or the team that's coming on. As a wild card competitor, I would agree with that. I don't think the Chiefs are going to be able to hold their water and get there anyway, not to 10 wins or 9 wins or wherever the Ravens are going to be at that point. But it is fascinating that it feels a little more locked in that you would not see San Diego. Even if they are the surging team, they still would be the 4 seed, and the Ravens would wind up avoiding them completely. Not that going to Pittsburgh or New England is avoiding them, but that would be part of this journey would be we probably should be focused on Tennessee and Jacksonville the next couple of weeks. Meanwhile, Tennessee goes to Arizona and to San Francisco with a revitalized Jimmy Garoppolo at this point. And they have the Rams at home and Jacksonville at home. So that last game is in Nashville on New Year's Eve. And that game will mean a lot. I mean, it'll probably mean the division at this point. Meanwhile, Jacksonville also, not with an easy schedule, they have the Seattle Seahawks, who are now the best team in America because they beat Philadelphia Sunday night. Houston at home. Then they go to San Francisco for Garoppolo. And then they go to Tennessee. So I would say Jacksonville's a little bit of an outsider here. They have a tougher road than Nashville does at this point.
Yeah, I think that's fair. And I don't think it's impossible that the Ravens could jump to the 5 seed. I just think that's improbable when you consider it's really a 2-game deficit with 4 to play. And knowing, to me, I mean, if you want any discussion of that, you're going to have to beat Pittsburgh. Then,
okay, fair enough. I'll agree with that. But because they play each other, one of them's going to pick up a loss last week. So we know that.
Yeah, like I said, I mean, if the Ravens beat Pittsburgh, then okay, I'll hear some really interesting discussion about the number 5 seed. But yeah, I mean, when it comes down to just being a wild card, you're going to go on the road either way. And I mean, you look at those potential matchups right now. It would be Tennessee, and the 5 seed would then go to play the AFC West winner. Right now, I said Kansas City, I guess, by tiebreakers, but that's going to change. And the Chiefs are looking like a team that, and we've seen teams turn around before. And the Ravens 5 years ago were a good example of that when they were in the midst of a 3-game losing streak in December. But
we were Flacco planking about this time then, weren't we?
Yeah. I mean, it was close to it. Actually, a week or two away from that, actually. But that's going to be an interesting race. Like I said, I think the eyeball test, the Chargers look like the biggest threat. But I guess if it can somehow be the Raiders because of maybe what the expectations were going into the season, what they looked like last year before Derek Carr got hurt, then maybe we're talking about that. But I don't know. I was really high on the Raiders going into the season. Even midway through the year, I thought if there was one of those disappointing teams in the conference that could make a run, I was still thinking maybe it could be the Raiders. But I don't know. Red Zone Channel was on in the press box as I was finishing up my post-game work at the stadium after the Ravens win, and seeing them kind of just grind out a win over Geno Smith and the Giants, just I'm not buying what they're selling anymore. And maybe they do survive, but at this point, of those 3 AFC West teams tied for first place, the Chargers are the only one that, from an eyeballs test standpoint, from a threat standpoint, from a standpoint of having to go out there and play them potentially as a wild card, they're the one team that right now they check boxes that make them scary, make them formidable potentially at least, whereas the other 2 teams, hard to look at them and say they're much of a threat to do anything in January. But we'll see how it plays out. As we were talking a month ago, things have changed dramatically. A month ago, as we're getting ready, or a month from now, as we're getting ready to potentially talk about the Ravens in the first round of the playoffs, things can change a lot between now and then.
Couple things for you off the scoreboard over the weekend. Obviously we talked about Tyrod Taylor and them faltering against New England. No shocker there. The Minnesota Vikings. I don't know that. I mean, you and I are going to live there for a week. We're going to be cold as hell. We're going to be broadcasting from the Super Bowl, no matter who's there in about 7 or 8 weeks. But I'm starting to think this is going to be a fascinating January where they're going to have a week off. They're going to have a chance to think about things. I think they're going to play a home game with a chance to play potentially another home game at some point. The Vikings have really shown me something that I didn't think they had back in September and October, certainly not with Case Keenum, even when they were beating us.
Well, it's incredible to see what they've become. I mean, Case Keenum's been such a great story, but you look at it, he has such good circumstances around him, and he shouldn't apologize for that. I mean, my goodness, this is a guy that was a street free agent in the middle of the season a couple years ago, and had been with the Rams, and just was just one of those guys that you talked about in terms of why is this guy still in the league? I mean, that's the category of quarterback he was in.
Well, it's always hard to make that move when you're a number 3 quarterback. I mean, Tyrod's had trouble doing that, becoming a starting guy when you weren't a starting guy. And I think there's always skepticism when you're the guy out there running around in the first and second preseason game and playing a half or playing 3 quarters. That just defines who you are. And very few quarterbacks make that move later in their career, in their 3rd, 4th, 5th year of becoming a star player, let alone just a guy that can quarterback an 8-8 team, right?
Yeah. But you look at their defense. I mean, a few weeks ago they held the Rams to 7 points. You know, they held the Lions to 23 points on Thanksgiving, and that was a game where they got a lead, and you know Matt Stafford was able to open it up a little bit more in the second half of that game. But to go to Atlanta and hold the Falcons to 9 points, you hold the Rams and the Falcons, and I know the Falcons have had their issues offensively, certainly haven't been nearly as good statistically as they were a year ago, but you go on the road and you hold that offense to 9 points, that's saying something. So this is a Vikings team that the defense has been superb, the offensive line is much improved, they have 2 really good receivers in Thielen and Stephon Diggs, they have a good tight end, their running game has been productive enough. I mean, they don't check a box in terms of having a quarterback with the pedigree of a Brady or a Roethlisberger or even a Joe Flacco in terms of someone who's done it in the postseason. But Case Keenum's playing really good football, and they look like a team that they just know how to win. It's not always real pretty, but you just go and look at what they've done and consider what they've been through with losing Sam Bradford and having Keenum come in, and they didn't get off to the best start either. If you think about it, I mean, go back to week 2 and they lost a blowout at Pittsburgh, and they lost a home game to the Lions in week 4. So it's been really impressive to see what they've done, and at 10-2. I mean, it's sitting right there for them to potentially be the number 1 seed, certainly for a first-round bye at the very least. So it's been impressive, and it is kind of intriguing the thought of, and we've had this scenario a few times where a team's been decent, at least, and in the playoff hunt, and talking about the possibility of a home Super Bowl. Minnesota being 10-2 as we're into the month of December now, that's about as compelling as it's been as far as one of these scenarios playing out where a team's playing in its home stadium for the Super Bowl. So it's going to be fun. And you have to give them a lot of credit because, it's not as though they've had the easiest schedule in the world or anything like that. I mean, they've beaten some good teams. And here recently, they've beaten some really good offenses, or at least good offensive talent they've made look very pedestrian.
New Orleans Saints, I got home in time to watch them run around, and you know how I feel about Cam Newton. It's just always a pleasure to root against him. And by the way, I was looking down when Flacco was doing the Cam Newton thing at the podium. Jameis Winston, I'm sorry, I missed it. I missed the whole thing, the eating, licking the fingers thing, and I looked up and Flacco was smiling at me, and I'm like, I missed it. I was tweeting. What did you do? But anyway, the Cam Newton thing, watching him run around against the Saints, the Saints look far better than I thought possible. The Vikings look far better than I thought possible. The Rams, the Eagles, I mean, as we sit here into December, these were not the teams we were talking about back in August, that's for sure.
Well, and the common theme here is we're talking about just how good the NFC is. In the AFC right now, and apologies to the Ravens and Tennessee and Jacksonville, it's 2 teams that you're really talking about right now having a legitimate chance to get to the Super Bowl. And when I say legitimate, a great chance. 2 teams that you really can envision. I still have a difficult time envisioning the Ravens making the Super Bowl at this point. Same with Jacksonville, same with Tennessee, same with whoever survives from the AFC West. But you can easily envision New England or Pittsburgh getting there. In the NFC, and I know the Eagles stubbed their toe on Sunday night playing at Seattle in what was a must-win game for the Seahawks when you look at what this wild card picture looks like in the NFC. But I can envision almost any of these teams getting there. I mean, Minnesota is one of the teams that you'd say, really? I mean, is Case Keenum going to get to a Super Bowl? But, hey, they're 10-2. Philadelphia has been superb. I mean, the Rams have been, McVay's been the coach of the year, and they've been maybe the best story in the NFL this year when you consider where they were last year and how their offense was dead last and how they've been right at the top all year. The Saints, you said it, and I agree. I mean, I think they are as formidable as they've been since they won the Super Bowl back in 2009.
And they got a real coach and a real quarterback. I mean, you talk about once we get into when the bullets are flying, Case Keenum, okay, Jared Goff, fine, Wentz, all right, even it looks like Prince Harry, great. Breeze will be the guy that will be the veteran guy. And they're going to get a home game to start things off if they can hold water here. Although, they have two teams in high-speed pursuit. There's a lot of games left in the South in the coming weeks between the Saints and the Panthers and the Falcons. But, at first blush, winning that game on Sunday, that changed everything for me with the Saints.
Yeah, and I mean, they've run the ball well. Their defense is much better than it's been in a long, long time. And you still have Drew Brees. You still have Sean Payton. I mean, that counts for something. And, while we're on that subject, as much as Seattle's been ravaged by injuries and the Legion of Boom is really no more other than, Earl Thomas,
they got it done.
The Seahawks, because Russell Wilson's been terrific. I mean, he has been outstanding. He's put that team on his back. So, don't sleep on them. I mean, Carolina's gotten to a Super Bowl. I mean, the Falcons, if they can figure out a way to get in, you can make a compelling argument for, to some degree, and, certainly there'd be a pecking order. Certainly Vegas would have its favorites, but any of the 6 teams that get in the NFC, you could make some form of a compelling argument for any of those teams. I don't think that's the case in the AFC, but it just speaks to how good the NFC has been this year and how much it's going to be must-see viewing as far as these games over the final month to try to figure out how this is all going to play out. But
they're interlocked, too. I mean, Carolina plays Minnesota this week. Do you know New Orleans has not played Atlanta yet? They're going to play each other twice in the next 4 weeks. The Rams also play the Eagles. So, I mean, there are going to be losses. Where it is right now, sort of these gaudy statistical 10-2s and 9-3s and whatnot. There's a lot of football amongst these teams over the last quarter of the season. There are going to be some losses taken on here. Hey, if Atlanta has, the schedule of all schedules, it's difficult, but they are trailing. They really do have it in their own hands. They don't have to worry about anybody beating anybody for them. They can go out and do it for themselves. They have 2 games left with New Orleans and a season finale against Carolina. They have the ability to beat up their competitor.
Yeah, and that's all you can ask for. I mean, as much as you're Atlanta not liking being on the outside looking in, you got a chance to control it. And that goes back to our conversation. I mean, it's fun to scoreboard watch, unless you're in a position where you need 3 or 4 different things to happen in a given week. So it's fun to have compelling races. And yes, there's intrigue with what's going to happen in the AFC, but when it's compelling and it's really good on top of that, that's what you have in the NFC. And that's just, it's a case of, if the Ravens aren't on and you're watching Red Zone Channel, as many people will be doing next Sunday, waiting for the Ravens to play on Sunday night, you're just going to be checking out these games and seeing how it's all going to play out. But it really is amazing. You clearly have your favorites in the NFC, and I still hold the Eagles in very high regard. Just because they lost to at Seattle on Sunday night, I don't think that's anything to be ashamed of. But you have them, you have the Vikings. But, there are, if you told me right now of those top 7 teams in the NFC, if you told me any of those 7 teams right now, we'd be talking about in roughly 2 months talking about them in the Super Bowl, I don't know if I'd be all that shocked. Maybe the Rams, just because they are so young, and maybe I'd have a tough time believing that. But other than that, I would buy any of those teams getting to Minnesota for Super Bowl 52. That's just how good and how wide open that NFC feels right now.
He is Luke Jones. He is Baltimore Luke out on Twitter. He'll be on the backfields at Owings Mills. It is Pittsburgh Sucks week around here as we head to the Confluence on Sunday night for Ravens and Steelers. It all sounds so familiar. Anything you miss here, you can find in the buyatoyota.com audio vault 24 hours a day from anywhere in the world on your mobile device by downloading the TuneIn radio app. We do come in crystal clear. Our morning newspaper ships directly and digitally to your email inbox Box at 7 a.m. It's all brought to you by Planet Fitness and PlanetFitness.com, where it's still $10 a month and never any commitment. Last but never least, any breaking news this week, and who knows, the Orioles might do something. It's all brought to you by Coons Ford of Security Boulevard. That is our WNST breaking news text service. Never spam. Always breaking news, always brought to you by Coons Ford. And, of course, Dennis will be here on Thursday from 3 until 5. It is the SSV on WNST. As for me, I am a very available individual, nasty at WNST.net, for all praise and criticism. I appreciate the praise more. Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, Snapchat, Instagram, streaming live on our Facebook, as well as our YouTube WNSTV channel. Weekend in Pittsburgh. Lovely. We are WNST.net, AM 1570 and WNST Towson, Baltimore, and we never stop talking Baltimore sports.